going to do a quick little demonstration of a small sample of knitting, just so you can see all the steps put together. I'm not going to go too slowly for any of these things. I'm going to start with long tail cast on. Give myself a longer tail. There's a slow video of this long tail cast on the website. Just do a small sample. Okay, now we're going to begin knitting this little flat sample. We have this tail yarn to deal with. We can't just cut it off too close. We have to work it in somehow before we cut it, or it'll all unravel. So to do that, to work it in, the easiest way is to just knit it with the strand of yarn as if they were one strand. So our first knit stitch will have both strands of yarn, and our second knit stitch, and our third. Work it into 3 stitches. Now I can just drop that end, and later I can cut it off. I'm knitting this row. Oop, I slipped a stitch. Get back there. Almost to the end. Maybe I should have made a smaller sample. Okay, so that's row 1. Now we'll put the needle in our left hand. So we're switching needles in the other hand. And now I'm ready to knit the next row. Go up into this stitch. One problem people often find is that the first stitch can get, the end stitches can get kind of loose and irregular and not look too nice. There's a couple of solutions which I'll tell you about. One common solution is to just slip the first stitch. You can the other solution is to work the stitch extra tight, but I like to, there's really no better way, but my habit is to do the slip method. You put your needle in as if you're going to knit it and just slip it off. And you don't work it at the beginning of the row. You work it later when you come to it at the end of the row, but not at the beginning. So that means the end stitches are only worked once every other row. And that stretches them out over 2 rows, so their tendency to be loose isn't as much of a problem. Oops. So now I'm approaching these double thick stitches where I worked in the end. So I'm just going to go into both strands as if they were one strand and knit them. So a single stitch. Oh dear, coming apart. My hands are very sweaty in there. The yarn isn't flowing through them very easily. See, that's like jerky. So my knitting is very tight at the moment. Harder to do. Okay. So now switching the right needle into the left hand. We're ready to work the next row. I'll do the next row as a purl row to show you how to begin the purl row. So up until now we've been doing knitting. The yarn is behind the needle and you come up into it for knitting. For purl, the yarn will be in front of the needle and we'll go into it. Now I can either work this stitch again, like I was saying, and pull it through and off the needle, or I can just slip it, which is what I do. So to slip it on a purl row, you go in as if you're going to purl, and then to slip it off. That's the first stitch of the row. I'll show you one more time, just the beginning of a row. So we go in and slip it if we're knitting. Oops. Or we can work the stitch tightly to keep those ends neat. Or if we're purling, you go into, my tight stitch, into it and slip it off or purl it. I'll just show you binding off. I'll do a knit bind off. You can slip the first stitch or work it for a bind off. If you work the stitch, it'll have a slightly more square edge. Pass that over, work a stitch. To bind off, you need the 2 stitches on the right needle, and then you pass the first one over the second. And bind offs tend to be tight. I'm using the same needle size to bind off in this case, but for most of the time I prefer to use a larger needle for bind off because they do tend to be pretty tight. And unless you're really good at working them very loosely, it's ideal to use a larger needle. You can use a needle twice as big, and that would be quite fine. Now, I just knit the last stitch and I'm about to bind it off. I'm going to show you, I'm going to redo this in a second, but I'll show you what it looks like when you do it sort of as it is. Break the yarn. Usually I'll just pull this strand through and tighten it. See how it pops up like that? Even if I tighten this more, it's still, this edge is higher, it's pretty high. It has a tendency to do that. One way to avoid it, I'll redo this. Take out this last stitch. Put it on the needle. What you can do is work the previous stitch, the row below the bind off stitch, with the bind off stitch. You can work both of them as if they're one stitch. You pick up that stitch from the row below and the stitch and just place them on the needle together. This is one's a little funny because, ooh, it just fell off the needle. This one's a little funny because it's got the double thick strand that we worked from the first row still on it. But anyway, that will kind of keep that stitch down lower and keep it from raising up and getting too much height. So I bound it off and now pull this through. It makes for a much flatter and neater edge. And finally, we'll need to figure out what to do with this bind off tail. If you are making a scarf and it'll have fringe, you can just leave it and blend it in with the fringe if it's the same yarn on the fringe. If it's an object that'll have a seam, you can use it for the seam to sew up the seam, or you can hide it in the seam. That's a great place to hide any yarn change in the seam. Since In this sample, I'll just show you the final alternative if you really have no other place to hide it, which is to weave it into the knitting. You can pretty much just weave it, do it wherever you want. Suppose you could weave it in here, into the bind off. Just try to mimic the appearance of the stitches. So let's see, I've sort of basically want to duplicate 3 stitches going you can see what I'm doing. I'm just making this loop and then going back where it starts. And then ideally I want it to pop through where this stitch comes out. That's a pretty good duplicate stitch and a bind off edge. So after duplicating a few stitches, you can trim it off. Another place to do a duplicate stitch would be in the knitting itself. You would just follow a single strand of knitting. You know, follow one of these strands wherever it goes for a few stitches and just weave it in. And when you're done, you can cut these off. Leave a little bit of a little extra, maybe 1/4 of an inch if it's a good tight knitting. That should 1/4 inch is as tight as you would ever want to go, and you need fairly tight knitting. If it's loose knitting, you'll need 1/2 an inch or even more. Maybe I can go just a teeny closer. But you need to leave it a little bit or it'll just pop right out. And then the cast on edge, we wove in that end in our knitting, so we can just cut that and again leave a little bit. And that's it.